He was a man of faith. A man of discipline. A man who stood before his congregation every Sunday, speaking of righteousness, of family values, of the unshakable bond between a husband, a wife, and their children. To his followers, he was an inspiration, a guiding light in a dark world. He had the perfect life, a loving wife, 2 beautiful sons, and a career dedicated to protecting one of the most powerful evangelical ministries in the country. But behind the scenes, something darker was lurking, something far more dangerous, or so it seemed. Because the perfect life he presented was nothing more than a well-crafted illusion. The words he preached, the smiles and family photographs, the unwavering devotion he claimed to have, they were nothing but a mask, one he wore flawlessly. No one saw the cracks. No one questioned the man who stood so tall, so confident, so assured of his own place in the world. No one asked about the whispered phone calls late at night. No one noticed the shift in his demeanor, the tension in his movements when he was with his family. No one suspected that while he prayed with his congregation, while he read scripture, while he counseled couples about the sacred vow of marriage, his own promises had long been broken. Because behind closed doors, his heart belonged to someone else. And soon, his wife, his children, his entire family, stood in the way of the life he truly wanted. So he did what no one could have ever imagined. One morning, the home that once echoed with laughter, with warmth, with the innocent voices of 2 little boys, fell silent. The horror inside those walls would shock an entire community, unraveling a crime so cold, so calculated, that it would leave even the most seasoned investigators speechless. It wasn't a robbery gone wrong. It wasn't the work of a stranger. It was the work of a man trusted by thousands. A man whose job was to protect. A man who believed he had covered his tracks so well that no one would ever find out the truth. But the truth always finds a way to surface. This is the story of a husband, a father, a man of God, who became a murderer. Stay tuned. If you love gripping true crime stories, make sure to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss a case. Chris Coleman was the kind of man people looked up to. He carried himself with confidence, spoke with authority, and lived a life that seemed to reflect everything he preached. A devoted husband, a father to 2 little boys, a man of faith. He wasn't just a member of his church, he was part of its foundation. As the head of security for a high-profile evangelical ministry, he was trusted to protect one of the most influential religious figures in the country. He took that role seriously. His job wasn't just a paycheck, it was a calling. A duty. A responsibility that put him right next to power, privilege, and influence. And then there was his wife, Sherry. She was warm, loving, the kind of woman who could make anyone feel welcome. She had a lightness about her, a way of turning a house into a home. She adored her children, always putting them first. She had met Chris when they were young, full of dreams, building a future together. To the outside world, they had it all. 2 beautiful boys. A nice house in a quiet neighborhood. A future set in stone. But what no one saw was the distance that had been growing between them. The tension behind closed doors. The way Chris had changed, more withdrawn, more impatient, less present. His work took him away often, long trips, late nights. And when he was home, he wasn't really there. Not in the way he used to be. Because Chris Coleman had a secret. For months, he had been living a double life, one that stood in direct contradiction to everything he claimed to believe in. It wasn't just a fleeting mistake. It wasn't a moment of weakness. It was something far more deliberate, far more planned. He had found someone else. Another woman. And this wasn't just some meaningless affair. This was something real. Something he was willing to risk everything for. But there was a problem. Divorce wasn't an option, not for a man in his position. Not for someone so deeply tied to a church that preached family values, commitment, the sacred bond of marriage. The ministry he worked for had strict rules. Divorce could cost him everything: his job, his reputation, the comfortable life he had built. He had spent years crafting his image, standing before people as a man of faith, a protector, a leader. If he walked away from his family, it wouldn't just be a scandal, it would be a complete fall from grace. Chris had to find another way. A way to be with the woman he truly wanted. A way to erase the life he no longer cared about without suffering the consequences. A way to start over, free from the commitments he once made. And he had a plan. A plan so cold, so calculated, that no one, could have ever seen it coming. Chris Coleman wasn't just any man. He had discipline, structure, the kind of presence that commanded attention. A former Marine, trained in security, trained to handle threats, to think ahead, to eliminate risks. He had taken that mindset into his civilian life, securing a position that gave him status and power. As the head of security for one of the most influential evangelical ministries in the country, he wasn't just an employee, he was a trusted guardian, responsible for protecting a preacher whose words reached millions. It was a position that came with expectations, a certain image to uphold. He was seen as honorable, devout, a man others could count on. And yet, the man he presented to the world was nothing more than an illusion. Sherry Coleman had loved Chris for years. She had been with him before the titles, before the money, before the house with the neatly trimmed lawn. She had followed him through every chapter of his life, supporting his choices, raising their children, making their house feel like a home. She wasn't just a mother, she was a presence. Warm, open, a woman who drew people in with her kindness. She was known in the church community, respected, involved. But behind the smiles, behind the carefully framed family photos, things were changing. Chris had become distant, detached. He was always on the phone, always making excuses. She had sensed something was wrong, though she never imagined just how deep the betrayal ran. And then there were the boys. Garrett and Gavin. Innocent, full of energy, their whole lives ahead of them. They adored their mother, looked up to their father. They were still at the age where the world felt safe, where bedtime stories and school projects were the biggest concerns. They had no idea their father had made a decision that would change everything. They had no idea their family was standing on the edge of something unthinkable. But there was another person in this story. Someone who had quietly become the center of Chris's world. Tara Lintz. She wasn't just a fling. She was the woman Chris wanted to build a future with. Someone who didn't come with the complications of a wife, of children, of obligations that tied him to a life he no longer wanted. Their relationship hadn't been a one-time mistake, it had been ongoing, a part of his life that had grown into something dangerous. Messages. Secret meetings. A promise that they would be together, no matter what. But for that to happen, Chris needed to be free. He needed to erase the life he had built with Sherry. He needed a clean slate. The authorities who would later investigate this case had seen horrible things in their careers, but nothing quite like this. At first glance, it didn't make sense. A crime so brutal, so carefully staged, that it seemed almost random. But as they peeled back the layers, as they followed the evidence, they began to see the truth. The inconsistencies. The lies. The carefully constructed plan that Chris had thought would never lead back to him. But no matter how well he had prepared, no matter how sure he had been of his own intelligence, he had made mistakes. And those mistakes would be the reason his perfect plan unraveled. The morning of May 5, 2009, started like any other in Columbia, Illinois. A quiet, suburban neighborhood, the kind of place where people left their doors unlocked, where children played outside without fear. But inside the Coleman home, something unspeakable had happened. By the time law enforcement arrived, the house was eerily silent. No sounds of laughter, no signs of life. Just a stillness that didn't belong. Inside, the scene was something out of a nightmare. Sherry Coleman lay motionless in her bedroom, her body cold, lifeless. Her sons, Garrett and Gavin, were found in their own beds, their small forms tucked beneath the covers as if they had simply gone to sleep and never woken up. But this was no peaceful passing. Someone had made sure of that. Someone had strangled them, methodically, deliberately, leaving behind a scene that was both chaotic and chillingly staged. The walls bore a message, threats scrawled in spray paint, the words jagged and erratic. They screamed of vengeance, of warning. It looked like the work of someone filled with hate, someone sending a message. But to whom? And why? Chris Coleman had left for the gym early that morning. That's what he told the police. He had called the house several times on his way home, but no one answered. He claimed that was unusual. Worried, he had asked a neighbor, a police officer named Justin Barlow, to check on his family. When Barlow stepped inside, his training told him immediately, this wasn't a break-in gone wrong. This was something else. Something calculated. The investigation started the moment the first officers stepped through that door. It didn't take long for detectives to notice the details that didn't add up. There were no signs of forced entry. No valuables were taken. The spray-painted threats were meant to look like they came from an outside enemy, someone with a vendetta against Chris. But the writing, the way the letters were shaped, the pressure of the paint, it was off. Too controlled. Too staged. And then there was the timeline. Chris said he had left the house early, before the murders. He had an alibi, or so it seemed. But investigators started piecing things together. Phone records, security cameras, GPS data from his vehicle. They started tracking his movements, mapping out every step he took that morning. They started to see gaps. Discrepancies. And then there was the most unsettling part, Chris's behavior. When the news hit, when he was told that his wife and children were gone, there were no tears. No panic. Just a strange, almost disconnected reaction. He asked about his possessions, about his dogs. He asked if he could have his laptop back. The questions he didn't ask, the ones any grieving husband and father would have, spoke louder than the ones he did. As detectives pulled apart the crime scene, combing through every inch of the house, a pattern emerged. The messages on the wall, they weren't just random threats. They mimicked the emails and letters Chris had been receiving for months. Death threats, warning him that his family would be killed. But investigators weren't convinced. The handwriting analysis, the phrasing, it all pointed back to him. And then there was the biggest clue of all, the bodies. The order of the murders. The method. The way the killer had moved through the house, taking out his family one by one. It was precise. It was controlled. It was personal. Whoever had done this wasn't just sending a message. They were eliminating a problem. And the more investigators looked at Chris Coleman, the more they realized, the problem was his family. At first, investigators had to consider every possibility. A break-in gone wrong, a targeted attack, maybe someone with a vendetta against Chris. After all, the threatening emails had been coming in for months, warnings that his family was in danger, that he needed to resign from his job at the evangelical ministry, or else. It seemed like an obvious lead. But as they dug deeper, things didn't add up. For one, the house showed no signs of forced entry. No broken locks, no shattered windows. The front door was locked and the neighbor, Officer Justin Barlow, arrived. Whoever had done this had walked right in. The spray-painted messages on the walls, angry, threatening, were meant to send a message, but something about them felt off. Investigators noticed the way the letters were formed, the spacing, the style of writing. It wasn't erratic like you'd expect from someone in a frenzy. It was too careful. Too precise. And when they compared it to samples of Chris Coleman's handwriting, the similarities were undeniable. Then there was Chris himself. His reaction. Or rather, his lack of one. When he was informed that his wife and children had been murdered, he didn't break down. He didn't ask how they died. He didn't even demand answers. Instead, he made comments that left officers uneasy, asking about his belongings, his dogs, his work laptop. It was as if the reality of the situation hadn't sunk in, or maybe, it already had. Detectives started picking apart his story. Chris claimed he had left the house early that morning to go to the gym, saying he had called home multiple times on his way back but got no answer. His gym visit, his drive, his calls, on the surface, it all seemed normal. But when they pulled his phone records and GPS data, the timeline started to unravel. The estimated time of death for Sherry and the boys didn't match his alibi. Based on forensic findings, they had been killed much earlier, before he ever left the house. And then there was Tara Lintz, Chris's mistress. A woman he had known since childhood, a woman he had been involved with for months, maybe longer. Investigators discovered a treasure trove of digital evidence, text messages, call logs, explicit photos. And emails. Emails where Chris promised Tara that they would be together soon, that he would leave his wife. There was even a chilling piece of evidence. Tara had told a friend that Chris had given her a date. A date when they would finally be together. A date that just so happened to be the same day his family was found murdered. Investigators had a motive. Chris wanted to be free. He wanted to be with Tara. But divorce wasn't an option. He worked for a high-profile evangelical organization, one that preached family values, one that wouldn't tolerate a scandal. If he divorced Sherry, he risked losing his job, his reputation, everything he had built. But if Sherry and the boys were gone, if they were taken from him in some violent, tragic way, he would be the grieving husband, the devastated father. And nothing would stand in his way. Forensic evidence only tightened the noose. Autopsy reports confirmed that Sherry, Garrett, and Gavin had been strangled with a ligature, most likely a cord. The marks around their necks were uniform, controlled. This wasn't the work of a stranger in a rage. This was methodical. Cold. Calculated. And then there was the spray paint. Crime lab analysis showed no evidence of a second person handling the can. No foreign fingerprints. Only smudges, like someone trying to cover their tracks. Detectives began to press Chris harder. They needed a confession, but he refused to crack. He stuck to his story. He was innocent, he had nothing to do with it. But the evidence was telling a different story. And soon, it would be enough to take him down. The trial was watched by many, a courtroom packed with journalists, spectators, and those who had once known Chris Coleman as a devoted husband, father, and man of faith. The prosecution laid out a case built on damning evidence, a timeline that didn't hold up, a staged crime scene, threatening emails traced back to the very man who claimed to be a victim, and most importantly, a motive that made the entire tragedy all the more chilling. Chris Coleman didn't snap in a moment of rage. He planned this. He orchestrated the brutal murders of his wife and two young sons not out of desperation but out of self-interest. He wanted to erase them from his life, move on without consequence, and start over with his mistress. Prosecutors walked the jury through the evidence methodically, each piece reinforcing what detectives had suspected from the very beginning: Chris Coleman had never been a grieving husband. He was a man who had lied, manipulated, and ultimately killed to get what he wanted. The emails threatening his family, the spray-painted messages on the walls, the staged break-in, they weren't the work of some unknown enemy. They were the work of a man who saw his own family as an obstacle. A man who strangled his wife in their bedroom, then walked down the hall and did the same to his sleeping children. A man who got in his car that morning and drove to the gym like nothing had happened, fully expecting to come home to a crime scene designed to mask his guilt. The defense tried to cast doubt. They argued that the evidence was circumstantial, that there was no direct proof placing Chris at the scene at the time of the murders. They pointed at the lack of forensic evidence tying him to the ligature used in the killings. But the weight of everything else was too much to ignore. His actions, his inconsistencies, his digital footprint, the clear motive, every detail painted the same picture. The jury saw through the facade. It didn't take long for them to reach a verdict. Guilty. On all 3 counts of first-degree murder. When the decision was read aloud, Chris Coleman showed no visible emotion. No anger, no sadness, no shock. Just the same blank expression he had worn since the moment he was arrested. The sentencing was swift and absolute. Life in prison. No possibility of parole. No chance of ever walking free again. The case sent shockwaves through the community and beyond. How could a man so trusted, so seemingly devoted, be capable of something so horrific? How could someone who built a life around faith and family betray those very values in the worst way imaginable? The story became a cautionary tale, a dark reminder that appearances can be deceiving, that the people we trust most can sometimes be the ones hiding the darkest secrets. For Sherry, Garrett, and Gavin, there would be no second chances. No justice that could undo what had been done. But the truth had been uncovered, and Chris Coleman, the man who thought he could get away with it all, would never be free again. This case leaves behind more questions than answers, more pain than closure. A husband, a father, a man who stood in front of congregations preaching about faith and family, how does someone like that cross the line into unthinkable violence? What makes a man look at his own wife, the woman he once promised to love and protect, and see her as nothing more than an obstacle? What makes a father stand over his sleeping children, children who trusted him completely, and choose to take their lives with his own hands? Some will say it was greed, a selfish desire to live the life he wanted without consequence. Others will say it was something darker, something twisted deep inside him that let him justify these murders as a means to an end. Maybe it was both. Maybe it was neither. Maybe the truth is even more unsettling, that sometimes, evil doesn't look like a shadowy figure lurking in an alleyway. Sometimes, it wears a suit, smiles warmly, shakes your hand, and prays with you on Sundays. For the people who knew and loved Sherry, Garrett, and Gavin, the pain doesn't fade. There's no moving on, no getting past something like this. They live with the weight of it every single day, the whole left behind by 3 innocent lives taken too soon. They are left with memories of laughter that will never be heard again, birthdays that will never be celebrated, futures that were stolen in the cruelest way possible. And for those who followed this case, who saw the headlines and watched the trial unfold, there's an unease that lingers. How many other people are living double lives right now, hiding secrets behind perfect smiles? How many more stories like this are waiting to be uncovered? Maybe the most terrifying part of all of this is that, on the surface, everything seemed normal. Chris Coleman wasn't a stranger lurking in the dark. He wasn't an outsider. He was the man standing at the front of the church, the neighbor who waved as he pulled into his driveway, the father cheering from the sidelines at his kids' soccer games. And yet, behind closed doors, he was capable of something so horrific that it shakes the very foundation of trust. This story isn't just about one man's crime. It's about the illusion of safety, the danger of blind trust, and the devastating consequences when someone believes they can rewrite their own life by simply erasing the parts they don't want. It forces us to ask the hardest questions: could we ever really know the people around us? Would we recognize the warning signs if they were right in front of us? And most importantly, how many others are hiding behind a mask, waiting for the right moment to strike? Stories like this remind us that true crime isn't just about the details of a case, it's about the lives lost, the families shattered, and the questions that may never have answers. Every crime leaves behind a ripple effect, touching not just those closest to the victims but entire communities, forever altering the way people see the world around them. For those who knew Sherry, Garrett, and Gavin, the loss is immeasurable. A wife who trusted her husband, 2 children who looked to their father for protection, they had no reason to believe the man they loved was plotting against them. And yet, they paid the ultimate price for his selfishness. Their names should be remembered, not just as victims, but as a family whose lives were stolen before they had the chance to see what their future could have been. This case forces us to confront the uncomfortable reality that some of the most dangerous people aren't strangers at all. They are the ones who live among us, the ones we welcome into our homes, the ones we believe we know. And perhaps that's the most chilling part of all, not just the crime itself, but the deception that allowed it to happen. If this case left you with questions, you're not alone. What drives someone to commit such unthinkable acts? Could anything have been done to stop it? And how many others, right now, are leading double lives, hiding dark intentions behind a carefully constructed image? Thank you for joining us as we examine this tragic and unsettling case. If you found this story compelling, make sure to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss an episode. In our next investigation, we'll uncover another case that challenges everything we think we know about trust, deception, and the human mind. Stay tuned.